Today I'm going to review for you one of my most anticipated books of 2024. That is The Daughter's War by Christopher Buehlman. I read The Blacktongue Thief as soon as it came out in 2021, pretty much. I think it was a few months after it was released. I saw the cover, I saw the synopsis, and I was like, I need to read that book. And I enjoyed that book so much. It was one of my favorite books of 2021, and I have been eagerly awaiting for the prequel to come out, The Daughter's War. What I loved so much about The Blacktongue Thief really had to do with Kinch. He's our POV character, and he is just so fantastic. He's darkly comical. He has a great relationship with Galva, who is this very stoic, death worshiping warrior, and the way that they play off of each other is one of the big charms of the book. In The Daughter's War, Galva goes from a supporting character to the main character. This is a prequel to The Blacktongue Thief, as I said, and it really sort of gives some detail to the Goblin War, which is heavily referenced in The Blacktongue Thief. One of the many memorable things about Galva in The Blacktongue Thief is that she has a war corvid, a gigantic raven that was basically manipulated through magic and bred to become a warrior. In The Daughter's War, Galva is taking the war corvids out for the very first time, along with a battalion of other warriors who have trained with the war corvids since they were a baby. They start marching, there are some skirmishes with goblins along the way, and then there's a big battle at the end. And that is essentially the entire plot of The Daughter's War. Everything else is really character and world building and background. And that kind of, I mean, you could look at The Blacktongue Thief and say that was similar in a lot of ways, but there are some factors that sort of distracted from that in that book that don't happen here. And I think it made a world of difference. So when it comes to characters, in The Daughter's War, we essentially really have Galva, and then to a lesser extent, Emil, and even to a lesser extent than that, Fulver, this very powerful sorcerer. And that's really pretty much it. Most of the time, it's Galva and her thoughts. And as I mentioned before, Galva is pretty stoic. She has a very dry sense of humor when she's making jokes, which isn't really a lot. And spending all of that time with her was both a gift, but frankly, kind of difficult for me to read. It took me a long time to read this book. I was listening to an audiobook because The Blacktongue Thief was so brilliant. It was read by the writer, Christopher Buehlman, and just the performance of it was so entertaining, and the way that Kinch kind of cut through some of the pomposity that can happen in fantasy fiction. We don't have that here. We have Galva, and I really loved her as a character. I loved her in Blacktongue Thief, but she has no foil to work off of. So it's just not that interesting. And what she's doing is interesting in sort of a Tolkien appendix sort of way, because there's a lot of description of not only Galva and her family and her country, but the countryside around them and the world. So there's just a lot of information, but the actual story itself just didn't have a lot of propulsion to me. So pretty much two-thirds of this book kind of felt like a slog, and not an unenjoyable slog at all. It's just without that lighter touch and that lighter POV from Kinch that you had in the first book, you started to kind of see some of the cracks in the writing that I think were there in Blacktongue Thief as well, but they were papered over by the personality of Kinch. Then we get to the last two-thirds of the book, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It's very intense, it's emotional. The character work that was put in the first two-thirds really pays off for the most part. But again, there aren't a ton of characters outside of Galva and Emil that you can really grasp onto. I think Innocente, a little bit, she's just not really present as a character on her own, though. We mostly relate to her as she relates to Galva. The same could be said for the Queen. Again, a fascinating character, but we pretty much only know her through her relationship with Galva, so she doesn't necessarily become a full-fledged character. Some lightness is brought to this with Emil, who is Galva's brother, and he's basically apprenticing with the wizard Fulver. And there's some amusement there, there's some interesting stuff there as well. We get passages from Emil's journal within the book. And That's great, but I will tell you, I decided to read this as an audiobook again because of how great this audiobook was. And the narrator is fantastic. She does an amazing job, great emotive performances. She sings at one point a song from the book. The problem is when they go to Emil's excerpts, it's not always clear that you're jumping to one. Like she usually introduces them, but sometimes they'll go back and forth and there won't be a chapter break or anything. And listening to an audio, I just suddenly I was like, oh, realize, oh wait, I'm not with Emil's POV anymore. We're back to Galva. Like that was sort of the jump it made. And it made again sort of a slightly unenjoyable reading experience, just like slightly even more unenjoyable. So I'd say if you are going to read The Blacktongue Thief, I highly recommend the audiobook. But if you're going to read The Daughter's War, I highly recommend just reading the book and not going with the audiobook, at least the first time. When it comes to writing and prose style, I really like Christopher Buehlman's work. I think he has a great touch with characters. I think he has a great touch when it comes to world building. He does have a tendency to do a little bit of info dumping. There's a lot of telling going on in this book. That being said, the way he describes the world, the care that he puts into it is really appreciated. And I liked spending time with Galva. So I'm very torn. I'm very torn how to review this book because it didn't live up to my expectations. It was a kind of slow going, but it had a fantastic ending. And I did like spending time with Galva. And here's the other thing, there's a sequel coming eventually. And I think, part of me dealing with this book was dealing with the disappointment that it was a prequel. Because I think for a prequel to be successful, it has to have a clear purpose. And right now, I don't know what the purpose of this is. So that sort of lends a little bit extra to my ambivalence or my sort of confusion about how to rate this or how to feel about this book. But I do wonder when the next book eventually comes out that really takes, the ending of The Blacktongue Thief, which wasn't like a straight up cliffhanger, but pretty close. Like you had a clear idea of, okay, this is where the story is going to go next. I was very excited about that story. And then we took this step back. Well, I think eventually some of the stuff in this will probably pay off in a future book. And I think if that happens, I will look back at this experience as being more favorable or more positive because there's some really interesting stuff that's sort of seeded here that I would love to see pay off. And that, to me, that feels like that's probably the intention of going back and doing the prequel. If it was just to say, oh, let's learn more about the Goblin War, I think that would have been very unnecessary because I think we covered it enough in the Blacktongue Thief. Like, I didn't really want to know more, to be honest. So I think probably there's stuff in here that's going to get picked up later. Presentation wise, I think these are gorgeous books. I love both of these covers. I love the illustration style. I love the key color in it. And I wouldn't change a thing. I will say again, though, with the audiobook, I wish they would have used a second narrator to narrate Emil's sections. Not because the narrator isn't amazing and fantastic, but there just isn't enough of a change in the voice to really make it clear whether it's Emil or it's Galva. So when it comes to overall thoughts on this book, when I go on the various apps that I'm using to track my books, I'll probably give this 3 stars because that just feels right. I like Buehlman's writing. I like Galva. I like a lot of the details in this story. But as an overall reading experience, it kind of left me a little disappointed. It took a long time. It wasn't necessarily a pleasure like The Blacktongue Thief was, but I did enjoy where it ended up. And it's all kind of with the caveat that when the next book comes out, I do think I want to reevaluate this because I do suspect that this will feel a little more weighty or purposeful in retrospect.